We will be recording this webinar when we start after these housekeeping that I talk about. So don't be alarmed if you see that little red recording dot in the Teams app. Also, if you could please mute yourself and then turn your camera off, so it will kind of help just decrease the streaming noise. Sometimes when there's a lot of people in a room, it can cause some disruption. And then also, finally, if you have any questions, please use the raise your hand option or just type your question into the chat panel, and we'll field those questions throughout the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and record this. Oh, already is. Okay. So we're going to start with some introductions first. I'm Courtney Graham with Western Specialty Contractors, Regional Business Development Manager for Special Projects, and currently concentrating on our architectural sheet metal initiative. We have Mike Mastro, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes, Michael Mastro. I'm the Vice President of SIKA Corporation's, what we call refurbishment, sealing, and bonding, which is concrete repair and waterproofing.
Thank you. We have Cale Prokoff.
Yes, Cale Prokoff, the President of RoofTech Consulting and PaveTech Consulting.
Aaron Toney with Western. You're muted, Aaron.
The first technical difficulty of the day, probably not the last. I work for Western in Southern California and cover 4 branches on the West Coast.
Great, thank you. We have David Gramboy.
Hey everybody, I'm David with our Minneapolis branch. I am the assistant branch manager. I've been with Western for almost 8 years now, and we cover Minnesota and Wisconsin and the Dakotas.
Thank you. Keegan Toon.
Yeah, I'm Keegan Toon. Been with Western for 15 years. Currently in St. Louis as the branch manager of roofing.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Rod O'Bannon. Not Rob, sorry, there's a typo there. You're muted, Rod.
Second technical difficulty of the day. I am Rod O'Bannon, the Kansas City Sheet Metal Branch Manager, 123. Been with Western for 2.5 years and have been in the industry for over 25.
Awesome. All right, so there is our team of experts. We're going to get started with Mike Mastro. He's going to give us an overview of what we talked about the last time we had this, where we were then, where we are now, and where we think we are going in the industry. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off. Presenters, you're welcome to keep yours on or off, up to you.
Awesome.
But Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Courtney. And I realized that some of you weren't involved in the last presentation. So what I wanted to do today is kind of just take us through a quick history of where we've come from and where we are, and we'll talk about where we're going, or hopefully where we're going. So you can, next slide. So when you look at, last year, coming into 2021, there was already a lot of headwind when it came to raw materials and pricing as we were hopefully we were coming out of COVID, but as COVID started to change a bit, what we started to find is a lot of these raw material manufacturers, very similarly to, all of us, had, basically let people go, downsized, they shuttered plants because of low demand. They were furloughing employees. And so in the back end of 2020, we started to see quite a bit of demand pick up within the construction industry particularly. So this started to put quite a bit of stress on some of these raw material manufacturers. As we rolled into 2021, we already knew that there was going to be some pricing impacts. We already knew that there was going to be some supply impacts as demand ramped up, and these raw material manufacturers scrambled to get back online, right? So, get the people they need in place, get the facilities back up and running. Unfortunately, in February, we were hit with Winter Storm Uri, which impacted much of Texas and the Gulf states and really shut down production of most of the major raw material manufacturers for our business. And so this created a huge issue because, we were already amidst of, some real challenges, and this really kind of set us backwards. And then as we moved from March to July, we started to see allocations and shortages that were above and beyond really what we've ever seen in our business. I would say in any normal year in my 23 years with SIKA, there are probably 1 or 2 raw materials that we have some challenge with. This year, at the peak of what we're dealing with now, we were measuring anywhere from 85 to 90 raw materials that were either allocated or were not able to get. So it created quite a challenge for us, and it continues to create a challenge for us. Next slide. So this is just a couple pictures that give you an idea of what we were dealing with when we talk about, Storm Uri. This is what they would call a 100-year storm, and these are actual plants that manufacture raw materials. And so, we lost power, we had ice issues, we had a ton of insurance claims, and really it shut everything down until they can, really get back up and running. But aside from just having the issues with manufacturing raw materials, it had a huge impact on moving materials and moving things in and out of that region, whether it be by truck or rail. And so that further, kind of exacerbated the issue. So next slide. So the first thing that had to be done is we had to really look at a lot of these plants, most of which declared force majeure, meaning an act of God, forced them to shut down. It allows them to get out of contracts. So once you declare force majeure legally, you don't have to uphold any contract that you're currently in. So for instance, if a manufacturer of, let's say, monomeric MDI, which is used in polyurethanes, if they are normally contracted with sending me, let's say, 100,000 pounds of MDI a month, they no longer have to meet those requirements if they declare force majeure. So many of these, I think up to 13 companies had declared force majeure early on, and they were now forced with repairing the damage and getting their plants back up and running. So repairing the damage is number one, which we all know, when you start to deal with insurance companies, especially of this magnitude, it's very, very slow. And then restarting the plants is more than just fixing the damage, getting electricity back online, again, getting, their own products in that they need to get via truck or via rail to put these things together, made things very challenging. And then on top of that, we had some significant shortages when it comes to trucking and rail. Getting materials in and out was very difficult. We have a shortage of drivers. If you look at the ports, I know a couple of you, we had talked about this before, but the Port of LA, for instance, which normally has 1 or 2 container barges, sitting in the bay, right now has about 40 or 50. And much of that is because they just don't have the people in the port to offload what's there. So it was really a tough, challenge, and it's coming from us from all directions. Once we started getting what we needed and getting the electricity back up and the water and the gas and the machines were fixed, then everything slowly started to roll back. But where we would normally get 100,000 pounds of XYZ a month, we're getting 10, then we're getting 20, then we're getting 25. And a lot of times it's not based on what the raw material manufacturer can give you. It's based upon what they want to give you. So, there's been some speculation that some of these guys are not putting the pedal to the floor because they're trying to manage the supply and demand so they can charge more than what they have in the past. There's no secrets that a lot of these raw material manufacturers took quite a hit through COVID. And I think a lot of times it's another way to make that money back. Unfortunately, it's at our expense. Next slide. So, this is just a slide that shows, this is a SIKA instance where we talk about specific raw materials. I would tell you in a normal year, we meet with production and operations to talk about these things, maybe once a month, once a quarter. Right now, we're meeting with them probably 4 to 5 times a week to discuss what we have, what's coming, how we move stuff around. So I think it's important for everybody to know, not just at SIKA, but really with every manufacturer and anybody that makes anything these days, there's a lot of focus and a lot of communication that takes place within the companies, within the supply chain, to make sure that we can do whatever is necessary to provide some sort of supply to the market, right? Some companies have decided we're not going to supply. Some have decided we're going to supply in low quantity. I think companies like ours have decided we're going to supply, lead times will be longer, but we want to keep the work going. And I think everybody wants to keep the work moving forward. But what we're finding now is that a lot of these projects are component based. Take roofing, for example, where you need a sheet roof, then you need the fasteners, and then you need the insulation board. Well, if any one of those components is not available, the job shuts down or the job gets delayed. And so that's really what we're dealing with today. Next slide. So, there's a lot of different issues that we're dealing with today. The logistics one being the newest, we'll say, bottleneck that's occurring pretty much all over the globe. So container costs, just the cost to purchase one of those containers that goes on the back of a truck or on a ship, has moved anywhere from $2,000 to as much as $20,000. So 10 times the normal cost. What that does is it obviously includes or increases the cost associated with manufacturing anything that's inside of that container, right? So overall costs are shooting up. The understaffed ports just cannot handle the volume that we have. And then we have other little things that pop up, like the Suez, canal problem that we had with the barge being stuck in sideways. That had a huge impact globally on things that were moving from one country to the next. Once it gets here, it's got to be offloaded. We don't have the people to offload it. Once it's offloaded, it's got to be put on a truck. We don't have drivers to drive the trucks. So all of these things just keep backing up further and further. And what makes it harder is, as we move through this arena of procuring raw materials to manufacture finished goods, a lot of companies are having to look outside of the US to do so. So, now I have to go to Korea or China or Japan or Germany or whoever has it to get it. And what's happening is, when you have to do that, you may be able to supply, but costs are higher because of logistics. Costs are higher because a lot of these manufacturers in other places are just charging higher because they can. So all these things just kind of culminate into the perfect storm. There's also some significant restrictions and some geopolitical issues that are going on right now. Some of you may have heard at the recent summit, the G7 summit, there are a couple issues in China right now where certain sections of China are being, really looked at because of unfair labor practices. And basically, what they're saying is the United States will not allow imports of any product by any means from those areas until it's really figured out. They do not want to promote or say that they had anything, to do with some of these labor issues. It's forced labor, it's slave labor, you can call it what you want, but the United States has taken a very firm stance. Unfortunately, a lot of raw materials come out of this province, and it's something that we need to understand. So now we're looking in other places of the world to try to find feedstocks that we can pull from. And again, there's costs associated with doing that. The other thing that we're going to start to deal with right now is the increased retail demand as we start to get into the holiday season, right? Black Friday coming up after Thanksgiving and the Christmas season. Keep in mind, a lot of the raw materials that we use, for instance, one of the big ones that we use within our business is called monomeric MDI. It's a product that's used to manufacture polyurethane caulks and certain coatings, but it's also used to manufacture synthetic leather, shoe soles, sports flooring. It goes into a variety of things. So as everybody else's demand increases, that takes away from supply from us as well. So everybody's we're all fighting for the same scraps that are left with these raw materials. And what it's turned into is a gigantic game of hungry hippos. If you remember as a kid, everybody's just trying to get what marbles they can so they can produce for themselves. And then lastly, the additional storm-related challenges that we're running into. So Hurricane Ida just blew through, right? And while we don't have a lot of key raw material manufacturers in that Louisiana-based market, the pictures you can see up here right now, those are actually interchanges in the northeast region of the country. So the one on the left is in Philadelphia. And if you look at that, you say to yourself, well, geez, I didn't even know that they were impacted that much. The flooding and the transportation problems that we had throughout the Northeast due to Hurricane Ida have been enormous. So all of these things, again, start to add up to, the inability to move products around the country and the inability to really get what we need so that we can produce what you want. Next slide. So what does it look like going into Q4 and Q1 of next year? Next slide, Court. Really we were hoping by now that we would be out of a lot of this mess, but we're learning that it's just not that easy. Most manufacturers are tweaking formulations, right? So, we know we need monomeric MDI. There's a lot of different sources, but just keep in mind, it's not just a matter of getting it from somewhere else, plugging it in and making it. So in order to do that and change a formulation or add a new raw material manufacturer, you have to test the product. You have to make sure that it meets requirements, right? Because the last thing we want is to put a product on your job sites and have it not work the same way as it's intended, right? We are finding that in a lot of areas like epoxy resins, allocations are starting to loosen a bit. So where we had basically no raw material for epoxies early on in the year, we're now getting a good healthy amount, not what we want, but certainly a lot better than what we had. And we are looking at different alternatives and finding different ways to kind of build these products so that we aren't really hamstrung by one or two guys that just aren't making what we need. But the material backlogs are starting to get filled. However, next slide. We're making progress, but we're far from perfection. I think, the big issue that we have right now is normally for most construction-based businesses, when you get into October, November, December nationally, and you have a seasonality that's a slowdown, specifically in the central parts of the country and the Northeast, it gives a manufacturer like ours the ability to catch up. It gives us the ability to build inventory, fill back order, and really stay ahead of the game. The problem that we're having right now is all of the pent-up demand that was scheduled to be sold or used in June, July, of August is now being pushed to September, October, November, December. So the demand is not slowing down, at least not as far as we can see. Projects are still moving forward. We have had some cancellations, but for the most part, demand is very, very strong. So we're finding it harder to keep our head above water, whereas normally this time of year, we'd be building inventory for next year. Now we're kind of still living hand to mouth and probably will be for the next 2 months at least, and hopefully starting to build some solid inventory come the end of November, holiday season, December, and into January. But supply constraints are going to ease. We don't see pricing changing very much. I think a lot of these material manufacturers continue to really draw a line in the sand. It's either pay the price or you don't get what you need. And I think that's probably going to be the case, well into mid 2022 and maybe even into late 2022 with some of these products like epoxies where, the demand right now is just far outweighing the supply. So, it's the standard supply and demand curve that you've all seen in economics class, back in your high school or college days. If you're a material manufacturer that manufactures raw materials at this point, you are, the tail leading the dog. And so they have the ability to control pricing at this point, and they're going to continue to do that as long as they can. The other thing that we're starting to see is downstream items are still continue to be a constraint. So really what this has turned into is a gigantic game of whack-a-mole. Every time we seem to knock one down and make progress, another one pops up. And I think, everybody in all companies are doing a good job kind of addressing these challenges. But the other thing that's starting to happen now is this. Some of these products that you use to manufacture, name it, caulking products, they're also used to manufacture packaging for caulking product. So now what we're finding is getting pails, getting tubes, getting lids, getting, all these downstream items, it's getting more difficult and it's getting a little bit constrained. So, when one problem seems to be solved, another one, continues to pop up. But I think in the end, we're in a much better position than we are now. I think there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but we still have to keep whacking those moles one at a time. And really, I think they say, the best way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time. That's really all anybody's trying to do at this point is bite it one at a time, fix it, and then get to a point where we're comfortable. Next slide. So what does this mean for the end user? What does this mean for the contractors? What does this mean for the owners? I think prices are going to continue to remain inflated. I think you're going to still see price increases and surcharges, not to the same level that we saw earlier in the year, meaning they're not going to jump 10% overnight, right? I think you're still going to see prices creep up a bit. As you get to the turn of the year, most manufacturers start to roll in their price increases for the year. I think you'll see less occurrences of price increases and surcharges, but you're still going to see them. I think lead times are going to remain longer than normal. I would say with something like epoxy resins right now, if you placed an order today, you're probably 6 to 8 weeks out. If you look into the roofing business, polyiso board, even something like screws and fasteners, some companies are telling us it's 200 to 300 days until you're going to get what you order today, right? So we have to keep our eye on the ball and make sure we understand what these limitations are so that we can plan the projects accordingly. So with that, I think project starts are going to get delayed, and they're going to take longer than they typically would. So a job that would normally take 3 months is going to take longer because the materials are going to be kind of doled out in pieces, right? The other problem, like we said early on, is a lot of these systems, whether it's a roofing system or a park deck system, they're made of different components. And while certain components might be readily available, key components like primers or screws that really are needed to really apply the system properly may hold us up. So, really having an understanding of what currently is holding up, the pipeline is important. And I think lastly, transportation and logistics are still going to require additional focus and planning because, as we get into the holiday season, truckers are going to take whatever loads pay them the most. If Amazon's willing to pay more than everybody else, they're going to work for Amazon. If Walmart's willing to pay more than most, they're willing to work for Walmart. And we see it every day. We have truckers that show up, half load their truck, and then come into the building, tell us to unload the truck and leave before they take anything. Because during that call, somebody called them and said, I'll give you a couple $100 more if you drive down the street, pick up my material and take it to where it needs to go. So that's going to be a major issue for us as we go forward to make sure that even when we have the products, are we going to be able to move it effectively to get it where it needs to be? Next slide. So planning, what can you do? Really, plan accordingly and communicate as early as often as you can with your material manufacturers and your suppliers, right? Making sure you know what your distributors have on the floor, what they have coming, making sure you're talking to your manufacturers so they can give you ideas on what the shortages are. We do this with some key customers like Western. We have communications like this maybe on a biweekly or monthly basis to let them know what's coming so it's not a surprise, right? Prepare your owners for these lead time challenges. We're learning that a lot of times the farther you go down the line, the less they know about what really is happening. And I think luckily because of all the lumber issues and some of these other issues, I think everybody realizes this is not a manufacturer like SIKA coming to you and saying, we're going to kind of push you up a little bit and see if we can get as much money out of this as possible. I can tell you, even in a company like ours, we will not be able to recuperate the money that we're going to lose this year due to price increases. Right now, just in the United States, we're looking at a potential loss of anywhere between $90 and $100 million just due to raw material cost increases. So right now, it's really prepare everybody for what's coming. And if there's a lead time issue or if there's a challenge, make sure you let the owner know. We found that most owners have been very good as long as you educate them on being flexible with time schedules. Be specific. Make sure you're including material surcharges when you're doing quotes. Make sure you're including labor cost increases, right? I think a lot of people now, we'll probably talk about it in a little bit, but labor costs and labor shortages are a major issue. Making sure that you include the price increases as they come so that you're not getting hurt and that the customer understands why those prices are where they are. And really keep an eye on the freight costs. Freight costs right now are exploding. What was $2,000 to ship from point A to point B is now $4,000. And all of that really, falls into the project as a whole. So make sure you review these things, not only with your teams, but with your owners. I think right now, the best thing we can do is continue to communicate as a team between manufacturer, between distributor, between contractor, between owner, between engineer, so that everybody in the group knows exactly what's going on, so we can make the best decisions moving forward. Next slide.
All
So
right.
that's really all I had. I'm going to turn it back to Courtney. We have some questions I think we're going to go over. And hopefully if you guys have specific questions, we'd be glad to answer them.
Yep. Thanks, Mike. I think you provided some really good information. I'm sure it's still a bit frustrating for those of us in the industry trying to get projects scheduled and completed, but I know I don't see any questions on the side conversation panel yet, but we've added some questions here in the panel discussion that I think are probably on the forefront of everyone's minds. But again, if you have any questions outside of these questions, please feel free to type it in that side panel and we will get to those throughout this next section. Okay, so we're gonna kind of start with what all of us are here for, what we specialize in, but what are the current effects of a supply chain material shortage in regard to concrete, sealants, waterproofing, roofing, sheet metal? So we're gonna start with Aaron first, if you wanna go ahead and share your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. I'll take the concrete piece. So what we're seeing in the industry is there is a slight delay with concrete repair products like bag mix or ready mix, but that delay is really manageable. Doesn't really impact it too much. Just a little bit more planning on the front end. Some challenges we have seen is trying to identify some of the support products that go along with the concrete repair project that's epoxy based, like a epoxy based primer like Mike was talking about, or epoxy dowels. Some of those products are a little bit more difficult to find and source, so that could be a delay to the project. So it's just knowing all the components that are going to be part of the project and making sure you're aware of what the supply issues you may or may not have.
Great, thank you. David, you want to chat on sealants and waterproofing?
Yep, sure. So currently with sealants and waterproofing, we're seeing a slight delay in your, urethane and silicone caulkings. And if you have like a big traffic coating project, it's key to get in front of it and get the material ordered. The hardest thing to account for is the shipping and getting it to you. You can remain in communication with the manufacturer and they'll tell you a firm date of when it's going to be there, but a curveball might come and the shipping might be 3 weeks away from getting there. So just trying to manage those things and staying in front of it is the most important thing. But for the most part, sealants and waterproofing are a shorter lead time than I would expect, but it's there.
Okay. Keegan, do you want to touch on roofing?
Yeah, as Mike was talking about, roofing has been hit extremely hard. Obviously we're seeing increased lead times. Some stuff is at the 200-300 day mark. The steel products are tough. The polyiso, the rigid foam, and some of the low-rise foam, all that stuff has been hit really hard. So it's kind of job specific. If you can get a small job and you're flexible on materials, sometimes you can source the material fairly quickly. But for any job that's of a truckload quantity, a lot of what we're telling people is it'll be second quarter next year. And then of course with that is the cost increases. That varies as well. But for example, I priced up a job recently that I had priced up a year ago, and the whole job was 25% more. And all that was basically in relation to the material cost increases. So.
Yeah, no good. Okay, and Rod, you want to touch on sheet metal?
Yeah, so as spoken about earlier, one of the things that was brought up was the Texas storm Uri, and that has really affected the sheet metal side of things and pre-finished materials. The plants down there that were shut down, the PPG and Sherwin-Williams, they do the paint, a lot of the painting for the coils. So that has restricted a lot of the sheet metal and caused it to be delayed from anywhere from 4 weeks to 12 weeks, just depending on what manufacturer you're dealing with. And the other thing that was also in this perfect storm, so to speak, the NLMK steel plants, they produce 1.2 million metric tons, which sounds like it's phenomenal. A lot of coils that come from these plants. They were also shut down due to COVID, but they were out for almost a year on strike. So 6 months of the year was COVID, and then 6 months of it was sheet metal. So that has caused the coil delay, which also now has created, since the paint from the storm and everything else has caused the sheet metal delay. The demand for it has gone up. The price has now also gone up also, as Keegan spoke about, the price being 25% more. Some of the stuff that we've seen has been from $42 a flat sheet to $90 a flat sheet. So more than double the price just for a flat sheet of metal to make trim for any of the panel systems that we do. So the other delay.
Sounds like we are all in the same arena, unfortunately. Okay. So the other question we hear a lot are, what are the concerns with labor shortages, and how are contractors retaining staff during this supply chain shortage? So Aaron, Mike, and Kale, however you guys kind of want to hit that one.
I'll take the contractor side first, at least what we're seeing. I kind of want to address the first part of the question first on the current, what are the current concerns with labor shortages? So for 2021, I think we're fine. I think we've managed our way through it pretty well, considering all the challenges that we did have. We might have a little bit of a last minute peak to try to get some more work done before the winter shutdown kind of slows us down a little bit. However, 2022 is going to be a little bit of a different story. Especially, I don't think it's going to be every single branch is going to have the issue, but I think depending on the market and the work type that you do, you could run into an issue where the demand is going to be steady and the work is going to be consistent and opportunities are going to be coming in. And if you couple that with projects that have been pushed from 2021 to 2022, it's going to be very difficult for owners to get their projects completed in this time frame if that issue does occur. Specifically, the roofing market, I think we heard that there's a 200-day delay for screws. That could push everything back considerably. The other small wrinkle that maybe nobody wants to talk about is if you run a facility or manage a facility that has vaccination requirements to be on site, that could also add an additional wrinkle and reduce the amount of available craftspeople able to do the project. The second part of it, how are contractors retaining staff during the supply chain shortage? Well, I think the labor shortage isn't something that's new to the industry. Contractors have been managing this problem for quite some time. It really reared its ugly head after the Great Recession. A lot of people got out of the industry. They didn't want to get back into the industry. And it was difficult for contractors and unions to recruit new people to come in and work. So we've been kind of managing it for quite some time now. Some things that Western currently does that I think help us deal with labor shortages is we really focus on our safety culture. So we talk about safety a lot. And why is that important? Well, the employees who are doing the work for us, they know that we care about them. We want them to go home safely to their family and friends. So even if there's a lack of work and they get laid off, they're very eager to come back and work for Western. Or even if we're a little bit slow, they'll stay around and hang on a little bit longer so they can keep working for Western, because we do provide a great safety culture. On the micro scale, more branch to branch, we're really focusing on trying to do more planning of projects and leveling your labor resources. So you're not loading up with and hiring an extra 50 guys and gals to do the work if you only need to hire 10. So just managing your backlog and be a little bit smarter about how and when you hire people. Another thing that we're trying to do is we're pushing work to Q4 and Q1 where applicable. If weather will allow for it and owners are okay with it, we try to have that conversation early and say, hey, let's, instead of doing this in July and August, why don't we push this to, November, December, January? And lastly, something that is a benefit of Western is we have 30 plus offices across the country. So if a branch is slow because they don't, a project's been pushed off, we can shift those people across the country. So that's kind of from a contractor perspective.
Yeah, I think from a manufacturer perspective, this is one of our biggest challenges right now. As raw materials start to become more available, what we're running into is I'd love to run, and the plant would love to run, 3 consecutive shifts 24/7 and get caught up. The problem is, I don't think it's the labor shortage. I think it's what we would call a quality labor shortage, right? Finding the right people and good people to do it, I think is the hardest thing. So I think, the other part of this is making sure we have the right people in the right places. But we can't get people to run the machines. We can't get people to drive the trucks. We had a situation in California where we had probably what amounts to 30 people applying for some warehousing positions. And out of the 30 people that sent in resumes, only one came in for an interview. He walked into the office, said no thank you, and left. And the reason he did that was because he had to be able to tell his unemployment officer that he was trying to get a job and show that he was trying. So I think some of the state and federal government money that's been going to keeping people at home, I think it's starting to subside. And I think we're starting to see more people come back to work. It's going to be interesting on the vaccine front too, because any vaccine mandate that's put into play will have an effect on labor, right? So you will have people that hold back because of their beliefs or their vaccination status. So, it's really a major concern that we have, just making sure that we have the right people to pull the levers that are necessary to make the products that you need.
Yeah, I would totally agree with what Aaron and Mike have said. My specific industry in the consulting niche has not dramatically been affected, fortunately. That being said, we work in well over a dozen states with many different contractors and many different walk of manufacture. And we're hearing the exact same sentiment that the manufacturers, even if they had the raw goods, probably couldn't get up to speed. And with a lot of contractors, it's, again, qualified labor. As we look at trying to retain this staff, our fear and what we're trying to educate the consumer on, be it the end consumer or the installer consumer, the client consumer that we might work with, our fear is that they have a lag in products or projects due to material. And during this short-term delay, what do they do to maintain that staff, especially in a union environment? How long can they maintain keeping someone employed gainfully before they leave to go to another company, before they go onto the unemployment scene? So trying to strategize and keep folks busy until the materials do arrive and weather cooperates and they can start projects. I don't have an answer, and I think a lot of people are trying to find their own specific answer. Fortunately, a company like Western does have, 30 plus branches where they can brainstorm. Maybe they can do things with some of their talent to keep them busy. I don't think the smaller or some of the local branches or businesses are going to have that type of acumen or support. So it's definitely something everyone needs to be aware of. And one of the things I think we're going to touch on is how the contracted consumer protects themselves from their installers having shortages of labor at a later date.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, you guys make a good point about qualified labor, which obviously in this industry is incredibly important. So it's a struggle for all of us. Okay, so Keegan and Aaron, I'm going to throw this one to you guys. Are there any strategies to make sure my project gets completed? And is there anything I can do to protect myself throughout my project? Which is a question we do get a lot.
Yeah, so obviously this has been a huge topic, and the contractors trying to protect themselves and the customers trying to protect themselves, and we're all doing things that we've never been asked to do before. Part of my strategy has been telling people, we're still trying to accomplish the same task here. So let's not try to do anything drastic and go with a material that no one knows about or hasn't used before, or go with a contractor that you don't know. I think part of the strategy for me is stay the course. As Mike was saying, plan, prepare, communicate with everyone, and just make sure that everyone's on board with what the expectations currently are. So prepare for the longer lead times, and try to be as proactive as you can. The last thing you want to do is wait and say, I'm just going to try to wait this thing out, because it doesn't look like it's getting any better anytime soon. And then at best, pricing may just level out. So I don't think waiting helps anybody else. As far as, protecting myself, I think as it pertains to kind of pricing and stuff, that's something we're all trying to work through. It's tough in a competitive bid situation to include all of the potential increases that could happen between now and call it the 200-day mark, because you just don't know. And obviously you want to do the work. So that can be challenging. I would say, maybe carry a contingency amount of money for these price increases. And I think there's going to have to be some level of transparency in, what these increases are. And manufacturers do put out letters saying, hey, all these products are going up this amount. So some of that is kind of trackable. But I would say, keep an open mind, but let's not get crazy. Stay the course and try to plan.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. I think, Keegan, you did a really good job explaining it. Only other recommendation I would have is, you're probably going through the process of collecting budgets for 2022. You probably have an idea of what's on the docket to be completed in that year. I would say as early as possible, pull out that list, look at it, and see if there's anything that you can start a little bit sooner. If you can, and as long as the material is available to happen and it's able to be used, but that'll free up resources later on in the year when the massive summer push happens. So getting ahead of the curve a little bit, trying to plan would definitely help. Contracting as early as possible as well, I think, is another important thing to consider. You don't want to wait and hold out and sign a contract later on down the road, and then you're just longer in the queue is what it is. So the sooner you can get something signed up and on board, we can communicate with distributors and manufacturers and get the order in. Even if it's a longer lead time, it's a little bit more manageable. And lastly, I would say work. There's going to be additional costs that will probably come through in the next calendar year. So you want to work with somebody that you trust, that you have a relationship with, because the burden, it shouldn't all be on the owner. It shouldn't all be on the contractor. It shouldn't all be on the manufacturer and the distributor. I think you have to work with people that you can trust, where you can share that burden. And like Keegan said, be transparent. There are very creative ways to address this in the bidding process. So you might have to think a little bit outside the box on how to do that. And contractors can provide that assistance. I know consultants can provide that assistance. At the end of the day, we all just want to work with integrity and be fair with each other, but all realizing too that nobody's really happy about what we're dealing with, but we just have to get through it together.
Very true. And this is kind of a twofold question. How do you handle delayed starts and price increases after the contract agreement? So Keegan and Cale, if you two want to talk on that one, pass it over to you.
Go ahead, Cale.
Yeah, so this is something we've been trying to navigate and assist people navigating for going on 6 months now. The delayed start, unless the project is in dire need, you probably just need to look at the financing arm of it or the budgeting and make sure there's not going to be any issues, or how you earmark those funds. So it's not a use it, lose it situation. There's not a panacea or correct answer. So this is going to be very fluid based on each particular instance. Probably the most viable solution we've found to price increases after the contract agreement has been transparent material pricing on the front end. So when we would receive bids from contractors, we would ask for some sort of material pricing or generality. And only in these situations where the project will for sure be delayed. But once we have that transparency for material pricing, the contract can be issued, knowing all parties knowing there will likely be a change order coming in Q1, Q2, Q3, whenever the materials arrive, and we have revised pricing at that point in time. We'll review the variance or the delta along with facility management, property management, ownership, whoever might be involved, and help to dictate what the correct amount for that change order should be. We've had medical clients and university clients try to get very creative with contract verbiage. We've seen teams of attorneys sit on this question for months at a time. I really think the best action is get it under contract and just try to work cleanly and transparently to get the order for the material placed and hopefully create a start date that's sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and,
Megan, do you have anything?
yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that, and this goes back to the communication. I mean, the best way to handle stuff is just, trying to give people as much notice as you can. So, some of these qualifications are in every proposal that we send out. These types of talks are letting people know. Thankfully, this has affected almost everybody at some point. So they kind of expect it. It's kind of the beginning of the conversation. Like, it's almost a joke. Like, can you even do it this year? So just be upfront. The price increases. Another way to handle that, I talked about not getting crazy and using materials you don't know about, but the flip side of that is you can be flexible. What we are seeing to get around some of the delays is, hey, instead of using this type of TPO, if you switch to this manufacturer or this other type, I can get it for you, a month or two early. So that can get around some of those delays. The manufacturers, they used to be big on it has to be our system from the roof deck up. And if it isn't, it's not warrantable. Well, now everyone is being a little bit flexible with that. It could be a Carlisle membrane with Johns Manville ISO underneath it, and it is a warrantable system at the end. So if there is some flexibility there, it can help get rid of some of those delays.
And one quick thing I want to mention, the delayed starts probably something we blew through a little bit. There are dire need situations, and in those something needs to happen, even if it's stopgap. Whenever we receive a request for a proposal or a client partner wants us to begin the design process, hopefully they're already aware of this because of situations and conversations like what we're having right now. But we still reiterate that the project is likely not going to happen until summer to fall of 2022. Again, project material type kind of pertaining to that start date. The other thing we've seen is some money being pushed from 2021 or 2022 budgets into 2023. So our firm is currently designing projects that probably will not bid until winter 2022, spring 2023. So it's really just making sure that you're transparent on the front end and just walk through the conversations, because it's going to go better now than post bid.
Thank you, guys. We kind of did touch on this, but we'll give David a chance to also speak on it. So if a project is already under contract, what can be expected as it gets started? And then what can be done to minimize additional costs to the owner, which is obviously on the forefront of a lot of PM's minds.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so if project's already under contract, which is what we're trying to get towards, I guess what you can expect from Western as you get started is just a lot of communication and hopefully project management of getting it started on the right foot. Depending again on what type of project it is, the conversations will start with long lead items. And the first thing that you can expect is to get those materials procured and ordered. And then to talk about what Keegan and Cale were just speaking on is if there is additional costs to the owner, the best way to handle them is to be transparent and work through it together as a team for the project.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to do a poll here. You'll see it in the meeting chat. If you guys could all take a quick look at it and answer it. It's, have you had to put a project on hold or rebid it due to price increases and or material shortages? And while you guys are doing that, it sounds like we've got about 3 takeaways from what we've talked about so far. Is stay educated, and then strong communication with your vendor, supplier, contractor, or whomever you're dealing with on projects. And then just try to stay ahead of the project if you can. That's obviously a little bit hard to do in these times. As a lot of these guys have touched on, the good and bad thing about all this is the same thing, that we're all in this together and no one's really able to find a loophole, which is unfortunate, but we're all in it together. Okay. I'll let Stephen keep an eye on those polls and we'll keep going. Okay, so I'm going to hand this to David and Cale. How should an owner manager respond when a contractor submits an alternate system or suggests mixing materials due to the current material shortage?
I'll jump on this first. So when we design any sort of project, we look at a lot of parameters: building use, existing construction, owner's intent of the site or the project, local code requirements, so on and so forth. By going down that path and due diligence, it'll lead us to typically 1 or 2 best options, best scenarios for materials, installation, system, etc. So this thought that there's a good, better, best is really not true. I think that was just a 1980s sales pitch that we kind of took too serious. But in reality, there's 1 or 2 systems. So once the design is performed or that we do get to that ideal solution, we need to stick to it as closely as possible. Any alteration of that is going to either affect price, longevity, performance, etc. Again, being most systems are designed to performance, not cost. When you mix and match materials, it typically can affect the warranty. Some of the commodity products, such as I'll use fasteners or polyiso insulation, are somewhat interchangeable from a performance standpoint. What we've been experiencing is we will request that a client partner goes under contract with an installer. At that point, we would request a submittal package for a review. Well, due to the long delays in materials and the fact that some things are commoditized, some are available, some are not, we want the submittal package to reflect our design, be it the system, the materials, the warranty duration, etc. If we get further down the road to an actual install date and one of the products is interchangeable and available, let's say on a roof assembly, it's a cover board from another manufacturer. Maybe it's insulation or fasteners that aren't the same color or the same manufacturer as the membrane. We will review it and accept it on a case-by-case basis, but not until we have seen that the original material bill and submittals have been received. We've done this successfully, but the most important part of that process is not only our review to make sure that the components and the performance criteria are still met. We really want to make sure that the warranty holder has documented, and by document, I mean a formal letter from their technical department saying that the use of these differing materials or substitute or alternative solutions will be covered in that roof system warranty, or that full system warranty being what the system might comply with. That's vital. We've had emails come from local material sales folks saying, oh, this is fine, proceed. That's not good enough. In 5, 10, 15, 20 years, these emails and these phone conversations are going to be forgotten. So you need to make sure that you're protecting yourself and retaining all of this information. So if anything were to ever happen in a worst case scenario, you're protected.
Yeah, that last part that Cale said is the most important thing, getting signed and written documentation from the manufacturers that what you're going to be installing on your property is going to still be warrantable. I've had different instances in the parking garage repair where a lot of times the manufacturer wants the full system. They want you to use their concrete, their joint sealant, and then their traffic coating system. They're becoming more lax on using somebody else's concrete to go underneath the traffic coating. We had one project go earlier in this year where we started it with manufacturer A, and then manufacturer A decided to quit making traffic coating because they could not get the raw materials. So we had to completely change and get in manufacturer B. The project got finished and it got closed out with 2 completely different warranties on the exact same parking deck, but just had it clear differentiated of who owned what. So just to finish it by saying, make sure you get everything documented correctly if you are going to go that route.
As-builts are probably more important now than they have been in the last decade. It's not the design, it's not really what happens, it's that as-built. So you have that paper trail, that document trail, once the project is complete, similar to the delineation between which traffic coating was installed. That is just going to be so huge moving forward. So just make sure that that information is requested and provided at project completion.
Thank you. Yeah, as far as builds go, I think that that's more important now than ever, but also communication. We all know it's really important, but obviously documentation is incredibly important. So it looks like the poll numbers are in, and just to quickly share, it seems like 90% of you guys have fallen into the situation where you've had to put something on hold or cancel a project. So like Tanya said in the side chat, if you guys have any questions since you've been in this situation, unless we're answering all your questions, feel free to ask them. This next question is a hot topic, not just in our industry, but everywhere. But I'm going to have Mike and Cale talk on it. How do vaccination requirements affect our business?
Yeah, we're learning that they are going to affect them in many different ways. I think primarily, this boils down to workforce issues on the manufacturing side, but also there is some issues when you talk about field representation. If we have unvaccinated salespeople or technical people, will they be allowed onto the jobs to be able to do what they're supposed to do? A lot of times we're operating in an outdoor environment, so it may not be as much of an issue, but I think you are going to start to see different people take different stances as to whether or not, unvaccinated people can be present on the job site. So, it's something that we're looking at, we're keeping an eye on, obviously with the potential mandates for the federal government. It's going to affect our entire workforce within the company. We are one of those companies that is more than 100 people. Right. And we do have people that have taken the choice to not get vaccinated for whatever reason, and that is their choice. And so now we have to kind of figure out how do we manage these shortcomings if we have less people? How do we shift, job responsibilities? How do we make sure that we can still provide the level of service that's required on job sites if vaccination requirements are going to be something that we're held up with?
Yeah, and as a business owner, it kind of puts myself and some of my team in a concern with HIPAA and where this goes long term. So as we have clients, we have universities, we have medical groups that are enacting mandates, and I have to request that information, and we have to report that information, and we do it as vaguely as possible. But that's concern number one. Concern number two is we've had pre-bids where during the pre-bid, the mandate was set forth that to work on this particular project or this campus, vaccines were going to be required. I believe in Illinois, Governor Pritzker has now made it a requirement statewide on anything that's funded by the state. So we're seeing this privatized as well as now federally, or state government, I'll say. And nobody really knows what's going to come of it, but we've been at pre-bid meetings where contractors walked out and chose not to bid multi-million-dollar projects due to the vaccine requirement. I did some follow-up to ask, why would you not at least entertain this? Why wouldn't you want to bid it and just kind of see what happens over the coming months? Obviously, the projects typically can't start immediately anyways. We've been discussing for the last hour and 15 minutes. But offline, I've been told that the owners of a lot of these contracting firms do not want to, they don't want to know if their guys have been vaccinated or not. They don't really care, and they don't want to get involved with it. And although this might be a multi-million-dollar project or a $200,000 project or a project for a well-known client, there's other work that can be found. And they don't want to risk losing their workforce because, as we've mentioned, qualified laborers at a high right now. It's very difficult to find. So we actually just had a contract yesterday that is now pending because it's at a hospital. And we had a stair tower that was going to be erected, so there was no internal access needed. So keep that in the back of your mind. That's always a good option. But a couple of the work areas are going to require some controlled interior access. So we're having calls to discuss, is this even possible now? Or do we only perform the work on the areas where the stair tower is going to be accessible to the work areas? So it's definitely a moving target. It's definitely affecting how jobs are bid. It's definitely affecting the attractiveness of some of these projects. And then really, I think the constructability of some of these projects, when you step back and look at it and say the contractor doesn't want to know if his folks are mandated or not. So thus, he's probably not going to want to follow the guidelines set forth. Thus, the contract might get canceled if they bid it at all. So it's definitely complicated. And it's, again, case by case, not only state by state, but really building by building.
Yeah, and I think to Cale's point, the other part of this that we have to keep in our mind is, as we find ways and look at ways and manipulate how we're going to handle a project, there is a cost associated with doing that. And you may see higher costs based on accessibility and how we have to handle these issues. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think a lot of the things we've talked about kind of lead into this next question. And if anyone besides Cale has something to speak on it, feel free to. But Cale's talked on as-built being very important, qualified laborers being important, communication being important, and it kind of all filters into how important is it to vet contractors during these uncertain times.
This is something that we should be evaluating regularly. I think right now it's just at a heightened point. When we vet contractors, a lot of things we look at, it's going to be current craftsmanship. What is their manufacturing? What is their capacity? How soon can they start the project? Those are normal times. Right now, we're looking at really strength of the company. As we talk about shortening labor forces, as we've talked about the delay in project starting, the possibility of limited revenue or delayed AR down the road, how does that really affect these companies? We've seen some firms that have reduced down to repair only or shrunk their footprint. Unfortunately, history shows that's usually the beginning of the end for a contractor. They obviously had contracts already executed for projects that were going to take place in 2022. So have they been transparent about that? If they haven't, what does that do with that owner? Even if there's some sort of bonding in place, what do you do with a company that's going out of business or went out of business? You could pull the bond, but what do we really gain from that? So I think you really just need to work with design experts. You need to work with the local manufacturers. You really need to have a good tone of the work environment and the contractor base of where you're going to be performing your work, and vet these contractors. Make sure they're financially and workmanship based strong, and that we think they're not just strong now when you execute the contract, but when we look down into middle to third quarter of 2022, do we have any concerns? And if you have concerns, I would voice those concerns. There's questions you can ask regarding retained earnings and other things that aren't great conversations to have. But as a consumer, you need to protect yourself. Let's not just take what people say for the gospel. Let's make sure maybe put them in an uncomfortable situation to make sure that your project and your funding and your budget is protected.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you make a good point that this isn't, it applies all the time, but really, like you said, high strung right now. But also that this doesn't just pertain to contractors, but also to suppliers and consultants that you might use. So everything Kale just said, use that also when you're thinking about your suppliers and contractors and consultants.
It was mentioned a few slides back, actually, how a manufacturer said, we're just not going to make deck coating anymore. You know, that's pretty crazy. That's complete unforeseen. So as much as we're talking about the contractors on the slide, I would back it up into the manufacturing piece of it too. I don't think now's the time to get creative with a new up and coming or a new creative manufacturing style or a material or a product that you're not unfamiliar with or you haven't used in years past.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. The next two questions we have, the next two final questions we have are based on budget, which given how everything's going right now, a lot of people are budgeting because we don't know what next year is going to look like. So Keegan and Kale, if you guys could talk on this one, how much more should people budget for next year projects?
Keegan, if you want to jump into this, I think we're going to be on the same page. You made a comment earlier about a project that was rebid and where the new numbers came into place. From 2019 to today, we're seeing around a 35% increase. I think some of that's material. I think some of it's just workman, just the talent pool isn't there. And some of it's just fear. So they're kind of throwing in, the unknown. We've seen that some material prices are going to increase Q1 6 to 10%. We're going to see the same thing in Q2. That's not confirmed yet, but I think you're going to start to see some of those numbers fluffed in to protect the contractors. One of the projects that we bid in 2019 specifically originally bid at $7.54 a square foot. It currently bid in 2021 at $11.30 a square foot. They had budgeted off that 2019 number. Some things had happened internally. They delayed the project. Now it's costing them substantially more. We're seeing similar trends across all markets, and we're working over a dozen states, and we're seeing similar trends throughout, all markets, and really, I would say all of our projects. As Rod mentioned earlier, the metal shortage and the delays there. Obviously, things aren't getting any less expensive because of that. So, Keegan, I'll hand it over to you, but I think we're all seeing very similar paths.
Yeah, I was trying to answer. I was slow to the unmute button there, but yeah, so the one job I was talking about, it was a 25% difference for the entire job. So the material was 50% of the job, but the material itself drove the entire project up 25%. If there happens to be, if it's a sheet metal heavy job or a sheet metal roof, maybe it's much higher than that. But I think that 25 to 30%, 35% should be safe. But once again, this is a moving target. If we have another winter like we had last year that hits the manufacturers and it's force majeure, it's just we do this all over again. So yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, and I also think there's something to be said about the price to do the work today. So if you just request a bid to perform work, that there's going to be some assumption made that it's going to happen immediately. Whereas in full transparency, if you know for a fact it's going to go into middle to late, maybe even early 2022, that cost is going to go up. And we've seen today's cost to be X with some sort of modifier or contingency to say if this happens in 2022, this is the variance. So that 25 to 35 to even 40% delta that we're seeing is really today versus the reality of when the project is probably really going to happen.
It's good information, guys, and a little bit frustrating, I'm sure, for people to hear how much more they should be budgeting. But thank you. So finally, kind of twofold to this, and we'll have David, Mike, and Kale talk on this, but Aaron and Keegan or whomever, if you have anything additional to add, please feel free to. What is the best way to move forward with future capital projects?
Who wants to start?
I guess
There you
I'll start, Mike, from the contractor side. We still think it's the best thing to do is to get a project under contract, have open communication about if you have a heavy material project and what can you do to secure a price on that material that you're going to use on a project. Something we did on a project that we had won months ago, knowing we wouldn't start it for 6 months, was get a preliminary PO into the manufacturer that locked our pricing in place, knowing that when the time comes for us to purchase that material, that it was going to be prepared and ready for us and getting purchased at an appropriate price and not driving up the cost to the owner. So I think to move forward from our perspective is to get a project under contract and start the planning process and keep the communication open.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I think, and we've done that in a lot of cases. I think we talked about it the other day with a couple people here. We've all done it, right? You're going to take a vacation, next February, and you need to book airline tickets. And you go online today and you see prices for $100 a person to fly to Mexico. And you say to yourself, well, maybe if we wait a couple more weeks, we can get it down to like $90. And the truth of the matter is it never happens. Right? By the time you come to make those flight arrangements or you buy that piece of property you were looking at or whatever, it's gone up, right? So I can tell you from a manufacturing standpoint, in the next 6 to 9, maybe even 12 months, the prices are not really going to come down. So I agree. We should, lock in what you can now. I think most importantly is making sure as an owner that you have the right team in place. A team with the right engineer, specifier, the right contractor, the right manufacturer, all of whom can work well and communicate well together, right? Because I think, there's a lot of cases where we have a great engineer, a great contractor, and a great manufacturer, but somewhere in that line, there's a communication gap or there's a conflict of interest or, people are going in different directions. Really making sure early that you establish the team, sitting down from a pre-construction standpoint and making sure everybody on that team understands the direction is pulling in the same direction. To us, that's been the key for any of these projects moving forward. We can, the pricing we can work on. There's a lot of things that we can be flexible on. But when it comes to that team, if there's one entity within that team that cannot work with another, it makes it very difficult to progress the job down the road. And in the end, the owner's the one that suffers.
Yeah, to keep it short, it's two main things. Communicate. I love the team approach. Honestly, we've been heading a lot of this off at the pass. We've had similar conversations with multiple major manufacturers, and what Mike is saying is just being echoed throughout the industry. These price changes aren't going to get better. Things are not going to get less expensive. So let's get under contract now and find an agreeable contract so we can start moving forward now. We don't want to bid these projects in 2023 because I can only imagine, based on what we currently know, that they're going to only go one direction in pricing. And lastly is expect the worst and hope for the best. So as we're scheduling these projects out, maybe even before the pre-construction phase, we're anticipating a Q2 2022 start. If by chance those materials come in, great. Submittal's been reviewed. We're ready to go. We'll get a pre-con meeting and they can start tomorrow. But we're anticipating the reality of these delays to occur. That way, everyone is on the same page. And if the worst case does occur, which it likely will in most facets, we're prepared for it. It's not a worst. We were prepared for it, and the project will happen as planned.
Great points, Kel.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That is all we have. I think something to mention is, we've all been talking about this, but communication, it seems like, is the key thing to keep in mind here, because like most of these guys have been saying, it's a moving target and things can change in an hour, things can change in a week. So strong communication with your contractors, with your suppliers, with your consultants is probably really going to help, because the 3 companies that we have on here now are trying to anticipate, like Kel said, we're trying to stay ahead of these changes. So there's a good chance we might have some information we can provide, as things change. So we're always here to help. I don't see any questions on the side panel, but please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. We have a plethora of knowledge here with all 6 people that spoke today. If you have a contact at one of our companies and need someone else's contact, please feel free to reach out and we'll get you to the right person. But thank you very much for joining. We all hope that you were able to get some insight out of the conversation today. I know it probably is still a little bit frustrating, but as cliche as it sounds, we're all in this together and we're just trying to help each other along the way. So thank you, everyone, for coming.
Great job, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
See ya.
you.